Okay, I think I'm going to start. Is that okay with you all? You ready?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
All right.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome everyone to our first session of Lenses on Inclusion. Today we have Catherine Massie and Barbara Luborsky, having been working together as partners in Montessori inclusion for the past 10 years. I want to point out that their work has focused on studying Dr. Montessori's work with children with disabilities and how her methods and materials differed when she worked with these exceptional children. Catherine and Barbara have also forged a collaboration with the Montessorians and Montessori therapists and medical specialists from the Brugger Foundation. This team has been carrying on the work originally developed through the long collaboration between Mario Montessori and Dr. Theodor Hellbrugger, the renowned German pediatrician in the 1970s and 80s. We are honored and pleased to have these two women with us today to guide us through and give us a better understanding on how we can support children with disabilities. After the presentation today, we will be sending out a follow-up email with the professional development certificates and the emails of both Catherine and Barbara, in case you have follow-up questions that you would like to directly email to the presenters. So with that, please welcome Catherine Massie and Barbara Luborsky.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that very nice introduction. We want to thank everybody for taking time out of their busy days to join us to learn more about the future of inclusive Montessori education. I also want to thank you all for your service to the children and families in your communities across the nation and around the world through this continuing raging pandemic. Thank you. I'm going to share my presentation now. Okay. Oops. And just about there. Okay. All right, so we're calling this the Medical Educational Collaboration for Inclusion, a Montessori innovation for the future. This is just an overview of how we're going to present a lot of information to you today. We have broken it up into 3 parts. Part 1 is inclusion is not a choice. Part 2, making inclusion work, and part 3, Montessori and inclusion. And after each part, we'll have a short poll and then answer a question. So let's get started. So in this first part, we're going to look at educational inclusion in general. Educational inclusion has been a widely accepted concept for at least 50 years. Progress in making it a reality internationally or in the USA has been largely unsuccessful. Nevertheless, there's been significant progress in setting the legal and policy stage for inclusion in terms of international human rights policies and conventions, and in most countries, civil rights laws. And so we'll talk a little bit more in detail because it's important that we all understand this. Okay, so you've probably all heard of UNESCO, and that's a major international organization. And in their 2020 Global Monitoring Report on Inclusion and Education, they write, "Inclusion is a moral imperative. It is an expression of justice, not of charity. whether the differences, biological or otherwise, and however they may be described. All students require teaching methods and support mechanisms that help them succeed and belong. So in the foreword of this report, it's very interesting because I've been following these reports for years, but they finally, I guess, have gotten tired of trying to justify educational inclusion and have stated, debating the benefits of inclusive education can be seen as tantamount to debating the benefits of the abolition of slavery or indeed of apartheid. This is one of my favorite quotes trying to explain what inclusion is. This is by the Inclusion International. And it says, inclusion is not a strategy to help people fit into systems and structures which exist in our societies. It is about transforming those systems and structures to make it better for everyone. So there's really no fixed, universally accepted definition of what is inclusive education or inclusion, because inclusion is a process and it's not just one thing. It's the process of working to include and meet the needs of everyone. So I like to show this slide at the beginning because this really gives us like a bird's eye view of the types of disabilities that children who come into our schools have. And I've shared this with people in Europe, and it's pretty similar across countries. But this graph shows us students by disability type, so that for the years 2019 to 2020, this is a reflection of all the students in the United States who had IEPs. So they have been diagnosed with disabilities and they're receiving services under IDEA. And it tells us the percentages. So we can look at this and see, oh, year to year, how is this changing? You know, what are these kids who are in our community, what are they struggling with? And that, I think, is a really nice place to start when we think about how we can serve more children with disabilities in our classrooms. Okay, so just in an overall picture of the legal and policy landscape, the two most important ones to know about are the Americans with Disabilities Act, which started in 1990, and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD. So it's interesting that the Americans with Disabilities Act has been around longer, but until recently, they haven't really been enforcing it. It was, however, the foundation of the development of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The United Nations Convention has actually been signed and ratified by 177 different countries. It's been signed by in the United States, but it hasn't been ratified by our Congress. However, we do have the Americans with Disabilities Act in this country. So I'm going to look at some very specific language that, that is really good to focus on when we think about inclusion in our schools. So under the United Nations CRPD in the education section, they say that state parties recognize the right of persons with disabilities to education. They shall ensure an inclusive education system at all levels and lifelong learning directed to the full development of human potential and sense of dignity and self-worth, and the strengthening of respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, and human diversity. The development by persons with disabilities of their personality, talents, and creativity, as well as their mental and physical abilities to their fullest potential. This is setting a really high bar for all of us around the world. So it's not just opening our doors and letting children with more diverse needs in, it's also serving them so that they also can live up to their individual optimal fullest potential. And then there's this part, and this is really important because this is a part that a lot of educators are not aware of. They also have a very, very strong language around habilitation and rehabilitation, so that the people who signed the convention agreed to enable persons with disabilities to attain and maintain maximum independence, full physical, mental, social, and vocational ability, and full inclusion and participation in all aspects of life. So that means that we will need to organize, strengthen, and extend comprehensive habilitation and rehabilitation services and programs. And these need to begin at the earliest possible stage and are based on the multidisciplinary assessment of individual needs and strengths. So you will be hearing a lot more about that in this presentation, but the multidisciplinary assessment at the earliest possible stage is really important to successful inclusion. Then we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. And those of you from the United States are probably very familiar with this. This is where private schools and childcare centers, and this includes Montessori schools, cannot exclude children with disabilities from their programs unless their presence would pose a direct threat to the health or safety of others or require a fundamental alteration of the program. Now, of course, we know that number one always is health and safety. So, but then we have the part that says a fundamental alteration of the program. As Montessorians, we're kind of in a unique situation because the method that we use actually came from special education. And since Montessori was born out of a special education system, and it was built on the needs of children with disabilities. So it's really hard to say that inclusion in a Montessori program would be a fundamental alteration of our program. And here's some more really important information. And this is from Thomas Perez. He's was Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. It is illegal under the ADA to discriminate against children with disabilities. Just like in public schools, private schools must make reasonable modifications of policies to permit children with disabilities to participate fully in the programs they offer. And then another one, I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with this great website, but this is an special education advocacy website that is run by a couple of their lawyers for children and supporting children and families who have special needs and making sure that they get what they're entitled to under the ADA. And so they have these statements on their website. The idea that private schools don't have to comply with the ADA is not correct. Private schools cannot decide which accommodations they will provide. Title III of the ADA prohibits discrimination in public accommodations. Public accommodations includes private schools, and private schools must make reasonable modifications in policies, practices, and procedures. And the reason I'm pointing this out is we'll be talking very soon about some of the things that Montessorians have found really help in terms of making modifications and changes in their program for supporting children who have different needs. And I'm just throwing this up there because, as I mentioned before, the ADA has been around since 1990, and they haven't really been enforcing the laws that they have set out and the opinions that you have just seen on the previous two slides, but they are now enforcing. And I just did a quick search on Google and found 4 different cases where the US Justice Department settled ADA complaints by families against private Montessori schools.
Catherine, can you hear me?
Yes.
I need to just stop you for 1 second. You have something over the top of your slide that's blocking off the top of the slide. Do you see that? Do you see it? It's like a bar, a black black mark. Do you see that on your PowerPoint?
It says live transcription, closed captioning has been enabled. Who can see this?
You need to just click the exit on that.
Is that good?
Yeah, well, then there's one down at the bottom too. You see another one? Yeah, so you
That
need,
that one's my sharing bar. So
if you click on the dots on the right-hand corner, it should say hide meeting controls. And then once you're ready do you see anything where it says hide meeting controls?
hide meeting controls. Actually, no, I've never had this show up before. Let's see. Nope, there's nothing that says hide meeting controls.
I imagine if you just move it then to the bottom right-hand corner, it'll be out of the way for most things, but just be aware that that shows up as a box on our end if you're able to move it out of the way. Sorry about that.
Okay. That's
no,
very
now it's bigger there. So can you move it or no?
up here?
No, the one at the bottom. No, okay. All right, it's blocking out some of your text from your screen. Okay.
Okay, I don't know what to say. I've never had that happen before. Okay, continuing on. In addition to the legal framework that I have just given you some highlights on, there's a number of prominent educational organizations that have issued policy statements in the last about 10 years pertaining to early childhood inclusion. And one of these is from the CEC, which is the Council of Exceptional Children, and NIAC, which most of you are probably familiar with, the National Association for the Education of Young Children. And they talk about the defining features of inclusion that can be used to identify high quality early childhood programs and services are access, participation, and supports. Access is not just opening the door and letting a child with a disability in. It means implementing universal design in the environments and implementing universal design for learning, for routines, activities, and teaching the educational program. Under participation, they say, quote, even if environments and programs are designed to facilitate access, some children will need additional individualized accommodations and supports to fully participate in play and learning activities with peers and adults. And then finally, under supports, they say, quote, in addition to provisions addressing access and participation, an infrastructure of systems level supports must be in place to undergird the efforts of individuals and organizations providing inclusive services to children and families. For example, family members, practitioners, specialists, and administrators should have access to ongoing professional development and support to acquire the knowledge, skills, and dispositions required to implement effective inclusion policies. So there's a lot of things that we need to focus on when we're moving to be more inclusive in our schools. This is another one that was later in 2015. This is the Joint Statement on Inclusion of Children with Disabilities in Early Childhood Programs by the United States Department of Health and Human Services and US Department of Education. So they say that it is the department's position that all young children with disabilities should have access to inclusive, high-quality early childhood programs where they are provided with individualized and appropriate support in meeting high expectations, and highlights to they have a section that's listed as challenges to inclusion. The biggest challenge to inclusion is always listed attitudes and beliefs. These are most frequently reported barrier to early childhood inclusion. They also mention lack of comprehensive services as a challenge to inclusion. The lack of delivery of comprehensive supports in early childhood programs may be a barrier to the full participation and success of children with disabilities in inclusive settings. And then finally, limited time and commitment to building partnerships. A key ingredient to successful inclusion is a strong partnership between general early childhood programs and early intervention and early childhood special education providers. So we can see that there's a lot of programs and policies and changes that must happen in order to support more inclusive schools. And this is something that Montessorians also need to look at in their programs. This I'm just going to put up briefly. This is the National Association of Independent Schools, because there's a lot of confusion sometimes that people think if you're a private school, then you don't have obligations related to being inclusive and serving children with disabilities. And so NAIS really wanted to put out a policy statement and promote this idea that all private schools should be considering disability in their strategic planning, making sure their classrooms are serving all learners, and that even that they are recruiting and hiring employees with disabilities. So all the major educational organizations are in support of more inclusive educational programs. So we have a strong policy and legal landscape for inclusion. Yet, this is a study information provided by Erin Barton, who many of you might know. She's very closely connected with the Montessori community. She says that really we're not doing a very good job in improving early childhood inclusion, that since 1985 up till 2017, only 7.2% increase in early childhood inclusion. So it's really difficult. Inclusion is not simple, and you see that the expectations set by the laws and policies are really high. So one of the things MMPI is doing as an organization, Montessori Medical Partnership for Inclusion, we initiated this organization so that we can support Montessorians in moving in this direction. So I'm just going to tell really quickly a story that is really interesting and I think you'll really appreciate. So there are Montessori school policies that are very common, and I was head of school for almost 5 years, so we had a similar policy in our school. But we have to really always have on our inclusion lenses when we're interacting with families. So this is what happened. We had this parent contacted MMPI and wanted to know about the policies for Montessori schools and inclusion and whether that was a good fit or not. They had been trying to get their son into a Montessori private school in the toddler program. He was a little over 2 years old. And the school was saying, well, we can't take your son because he's not walking. And I know that that's a common policy in schools as children move up from the infant or move into the toddler communities. They have an expectation that the child is walking, and the school for 6 months kept saying, no, he's not walking, he can't come. And this mom, who is actually a pediatrician and also a person with a disability, she said, well, we have a genetic condition. He may not ever be able to walk. And I've been living with this my whole life, and I'm a pediatrician. And so she was really, really upset by being told that, well, if he wasn't walking independently, he couldn't come into the toddler program. And the reason was that, well, the students in the toddler room needed to be able to independently go to the shelves and take a material and carry it to a table and do the work. And so what the parents did was really beautiful. The parents invented a mobile tray so that their son could do that. And I have a little video of it just to show you. So he uses it as a walker, and he is able to be independent. So this is just a beautiful example of how we need to keep our our view on inclusion and what that means in terms of access and participation of children with disabilities. All right, that's the end of our first section. So we're going to have a quick poll and a question. And here's the question that you'll be asked in the poll. Were you familiar with the information presented regarding disability rights and laws pertaining to school inclusion? And then you can choose yes, somewhat, or no.
If you would like to go to the bottom of your screen to the Q&A, and if you have a question pertaining to the subject matter that Catherine has just presented and put in your question, we will take your questions if you do that.
So it looks like everyone has answered, and it's 10% who said no, and about 50-50, 40-50, 40% yes, and 50% somewhat.
All right, thank you. Now for the part two, we'll be having Barbara sharing.
Do we have a question?
Oh.
I'm seeing there's no questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
You enter your question. Here we go. Okay, this is a question from our dear Paula Glasgow. She says, could you please give the meanings of IDEA? I live in Europe, and it's really important that we include our international folks in the language that we use here.
That's IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so that is the major educational legislation that mandates that public school systems across the country provide specific services to children who are identified as having a disability.
Thank you. And there's one more. Yes. Can you share the resource? How do people get a resource like UNESCO? Can they have a website, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You can just Google, and if you, I guess I can put in the title. It's the name of the report. You just Google it, and everything on the UNESCO site is free. You can go to UNESCO and you can type into the search educational inclusion, and you will come up with, you know, scores of reports that they've written. It's fabulous information. They're really staying on top of it.
Thank you. Barbara?
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm so glad to be here with you. I am going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how do we make all of this work? And clearly, it's not enough to just open the doors. But the reality is that everyone has to do inclusion these days. These children are here. They are in classrooms everywhere across the globe. In many cases, they're not even identified, but they're struggling. And it's not enough to just open the doors and assume that all the teachers have their albums and they'll figure out what to do. You can't do it without input from medical people. So remember, Dr. Montessori was able to make this magnificent approach because she was both a doctor and an educator. So this is what needs to be done to truly include children with disabilities successfully. And this is the work we're doing in MMPI. We are connecting people around the world who are doing and have been doing this work successfully, some of them for decades now. And the key is collaboration with medical people. And that is what we are teaching Montessorians to do. This also means there'll need to be more adults in the room and closer partnerships with parents. So we wanted to share this with you. This is feedback that came to us in one of our courses from a participant. She says, I really think it's worth recognizing and addressing, probably with and to the training centers, that Montessori schools actually have too good of a reputation for being the all-inclusive answer to any child with special needs, especially autism. At least this is certainly the case in my area. While I'm truly grateful to be getting ideas on things that I can do, I am not a magician. This is actually my first formal class on special needs. I think a lot of Montessori teachers are thought of as experts in special needs, and then, especially in private schools, because finances enter the picture, that teachers end up in situations they aren't prepared for or ready for, and we are still expected to know what to do. I really believe this ends up creating quiet shame for teachers and can end up with them feeling resentful and angry. I genuinely mean this comment with full respect and humility. I really do think it's a major problem. And she goes on to say, I try hard to accept any child who wants to come. Then I get myself in trouble with the challenge of trying to help all these children. And I don't always have the answer. I promise you, I'm quite sure that I'm not the only one who feels this way. Truly, I'm in this class because I really want to learn how to help any child who wants to come to my classroom. I really, really do. I truly believe I'm not the only one. So these are the words of a frustrated teacher. And in her Montessori training, she was told Montessori is for all children. In her classroom, she's having a different experience. So teachers and specialists together is the key to inclusion. Teachers feel unprepared, and this is causing burnout and exodus from teaching. Teachers are not medical professionals, but they are expert pedagogues. As such, they need to share their expertise and get input from specialists to know how to successfully meet the needs of students with disabilities. It's not respectful, responsible, or safe to expect teachers to meet the needs of children that they are not trained to identify or understand. Teachers need specific training on developmental differences and on implementation of specific classroom-based strategies to successfully support these children in the Montessori classroom. They also need specific training in partnering with parents and professionals to understand how best to meet the child's needs. Likewise, medical specialists are not trained Montessorians. They need specific training so they can learn how to garner all the developmental possibilities for evaluation and treatment that are embedded in the Montessori work. They need input and guidance about how to best support children with disabilities within the Montessori classroom. Collaboration between expert teachers and medical specialists is the essential foundation of successful inclusion in Montessori settings. The collaborative process that takes place ongoingly among the guides, parents, specialists, and the children themselves, if they are old enough to engage in the process. Sometimes Montessori teachers think that because there's so much developmental support already built into the Montessori system, they don't need an OT at their school. The problem is that the developmental pieces that are built into the Montessori approach, as it is taught in current Montessori trainings, is based on the needs of typically developing children. It's the OT who can provide the specialized insights and developmental support needed by the child with disabilities. Not collaborating with an OT could rob the child of the possibilities for development they could have had through direct treatment from the OT. The teacher could also be getting support from the OT. In other words, engaging and being successful in the Montessori environment requires collaboration. You all know that Dr. Montessori began her educational work with children with disabilities. When she saw how successful she was with these children, she shifted the focus of her work to typically developing children. As she learned more about typical development, she modified that method to be more useful to neurotypical children. The approach that Dr. Montessori developed as she adapted what she had been doing with her children with disabilities is the focus of most Montessori teacher education today. This is the method that Dr. Montessori called the Montessori method for typical children. It's not realistic to expect the method that was developed for typically developing children to meet the needs of all children with disabilities. And in fact, it's irresponsible to withhold specifically proven aid to life on the grounds that it's not in the Montessori albums. To address the needs of these children, we need both medical and educational. We need scientific medical pedagogy. Since Dr. Montessori was educated in both domains, she brought all of her medical knowledge and understanding of human growth and development to bear on her educational work with children with disabilities. She was aware that these children generally do not auto-educate and that they need far more preparation, prompting, and support in order to learn. She describes this perspective numerous times in different ways in the California lectures in particular, as well as other writings. Children with disabilities do not follow a typical developmental trajectory because they have neurophysiological differences. Their brains and bodies work differently, and there are neurobehavioral ramifications to those differences. These children need individualized methods. To fully meet their needs, Montessorians need input from medical specialists and allied health professionals. Children with neurophysiological and neurobehavioral differences are in every Montessori classroom around the globe. All teachers need to know not only the Montessori method for typically developing children, they also need to know how to collaborate with medical specialists who have been trained to support these children's development. And here's one way to describe it. This is a quote from Richard Villa and Jacqueline Thousand's book, Leading an Inclusive School. And they call it positive interdependence. Positive interdependence is at the heart of effective teaming and involves recognizing that no single person can meet the diverse psychological and educational needs of all students. And as Montessorians, we would add developmental to psychological and educational. So I wanted to just take a minute to look at this idea of ableism. On March 13th, this is a photo of March 13th, 1990, when over 1,000 people marched from the White House to the US Capitol to demand that Congress pass the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. When they got there, about 60 of them cast aside their wheelchairs and other mobility aids and crawled up the Capitol steps. The Capitol crawl, as it's known, was a physical demonstration of how inaccessible architecture impacts people with disabilities. It also highlighted the urgency behind the need to pass the ADA, which President George H.W. Bush signed into law on July 26th of 1990. The youngest person to climb the steps that day is right here with this white and red bandana. Her name was Jennifer Keelan Chaffins. She was 8 years old, and by then she had already been protesting for 2 years. Ableism is discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. At its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing and defines people by their disability. Thinking about this definition, it seems logical that therapy is trying to fix the child. So it's not a good thing, and diagnosing a child's issues puts a label on her and therefore defines her through the lens of disability, negating her strengths and capabilities. It seems ironic, but actually this couldn't be further from the truth. When we decide not to label a child, we end up throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Because we don't want to label, we don't evaluate, and we fail to identify and address issues. We don't have any problem diagnosing diabetes and providing those who have it with the medications and therapies they need to be as functional and independent as they can be. Taking an anti-medical stance simply is not ethical. It reflects an ableist attitude because in essence, only the individuals who are typical and can participate and engage without supports or with only minimal supports are the ones who will succeed in these settings. By denying individuals with disabilities these supports they need to succeed, we end up excluding them. Without evaluation and differential diagnosis and input from specialists, we don't really know what these children need. We can admit them to our schools and then guess what we think they need and try to provide it. But while we're doing this, the child is struggling, the teacher may be frustrated, and the child's self-esteem is being damaged. And we're also wasting valuable time. Contrary to popular belief, if you talk to individuals with disabilities, many will tell you how relieved and excited they were when they finally learned the name for their lived experience. They're relieved to know that there's an actual reason, a diagnosis, a reason why things are so hard for them. They experience these challenges every day. It's their lived experience, and it often includes being made to feel inferior and that their difficulties reflect some kind of a moral failing. This is ableism. This is especially true for those with what we call invisible disabilities, things like dyslexia or ADHD, sensory processing disorder, or mental health challenges. We would never be upset with a child in a wheelchair because she refused to climb the steps, because we can see clearly what her challenge is. But when the child appears normal, but behaves or responds inappropriately, refuses to try things or cries and says, "I can't do this," the adults in his life often tell him that he just needs to try harder. So I want to say a quick word about differential diagnosis, and that means taking the time to sort of look at all the different diagnoses that have similar symptomology. So if you don't know where the dysfunction is, how will you know how to help the child? So a child with a thyroid disorder can actually appear to have learning disabilities or ADHD. A child who's having absence seizures can appear to have ADHD or be extremely fatigued. So sometimes there have been cases where the child is asleep on the desk at school or the table, and the school, is thinking, well, these parents are not seeing to the welfare of this child by helping him get enough sleep. And really, the child is having a medical problem. So it's really important to make sure that we know through the process of differential diagnosis what exactly is going on with the child. And one other point is that this concept of comorbidity, meaning some children will have both ADHD and sensory processing disorder. or ADHD and dyslexia. So you could have 2 or more things going on at once for a child. So I have this quote from Dr. Montessori. Therefore, the new method was called scientific pedagogy. The idea was, let us know the child first in order to educate him. The first problem was how to get to know the child. And that's from the 1946 London lectures. So I wanted to just give you a few case examples to describe how medical educational collaboration can work. And I want to point out that in most cases, neither the teacher nor the parent would be able to successfully integrate a child with disabilities into the classroom without the knowledge and insights brought to bear by medical and allied health professionals. So the child who's unable to produce intelligible speech, for example, this would be maybe based on difficulties coordinating the muscles of the lips, the cheeks, the tongue, together with the breath to create accurate speech sounds, and therefore speech that is intelligible to other people. For this child, the speech therapist uses everything she knows about the child, including his interests and his strengths, and she uses that knowledge in concert with her expert scientific medical knowledge to teach the child how to coordinate all of these muscles and the breath so that he can communicate effectively. She'll collaborate with the parents and with classroom teacher and staff so that appropriate supports and strategies can be provided and reinforced at home and in the classroom and in the community. This joint approach is effective and efficient. It supports and honors the whole child and ameliorates his struggles to help him overcome them and be an independent learner in the classroom. The goal is for the child to succeed and flourish and become the best person that he can be. For the child who has no awareness of his body and space, the OT will use everything she knows about the child, including his interests, and combined with her expert scientific medical knowledge, she'll help the child develop better body awareness, spatial awareness, motor control, and eye-hand coordination so he can move through the classroom without bumping into objects or peers or walking on someone else's work. Supporting the child in this way, in this classroom, will support him in meeting the demands of the classroom work. It will help him develop the skills he needs to be an independent learner and to become the most self-sufficient person he can be. It's the collaboration among specialists, teachers, and parents that makes this approach work. Helping this child succeed in the Montessori classroom is a gift that will last this child a lifetime. As we all know, children learn first through their bodies. If the child has no body awareness, his future learning capacity will be curtailed, along with his motor and social emotional development. Another child may have so much anxiety that she doesn't want to separate from her mom to stay at school. This level of intense anxiety may interfere with her concentration and ability to develop and maintain peer relationships. A child in this state is unable to attend to learning tasks. For a child such as this, the psychologist and the OT would likely work together to use their combined expertise and everything they know about the child and her history to find ways for the adults in her life to support her with love and compassion, both at home and at school, until she's able to be comfortable remaining at school. It may take time, but this child deserves to be supported while she learns to manage her anxiety and she becomes a successful Montessori community member. All of these descriptions of therapeutic intervention describe how a collaborative team, including the teacher, the parents, and the appropriate medical specialists, can support the child, the whole child, with all of his or her strengths and needs to overcome great difficulties in some cases to be able to successfully engage in the Montessori classroom setting. The goals of both teachers and therapists are fully aligned to support the development of diverse communities of independent and successful learners. And here's another quote from Dr. Montessori. I only provided means to help children to develop themselves as they showed me their needs and as, of course, the light of my scientific knowledge prepared me to do. Now these means of help that are but necessary and sufficient help for the development of life, these means are the method of education. So I wanted to quickly tell you a little bit more about Dr. Helbrugge. He recognized he is a premier physician, pediatrician, was in Germany, and he recognized that social isolation and exclusion are very damaging to individuals with disabilities, and that excluding them from social life would really exacerbate the deficits and the impact of the disability on the child's functional capabilities. He worked for many years, and in 1981, he identified his work as social pediatric developmental rehabilitation. And his work is carried on to this day at children's centers in Germany, as well as projects across the globe. So here is their map of all the places where they have projects, including one in the US, which is our course that happened in Milwaukee in 2019. So we are now offering another course. In Milwaukee, we offered Foundations of Montessori Inclusion, FMI. This seems to want to automatically move forward. And now we are offering FMIE, Foundations of Montessori Inclusion in Elementary. So the assumptions of this model are children with disabilities are complex whole beings, and they often demonstrate challenges in multiple areas. All children are learning through exploration and experience, pursuing goals and solving problems. Therefore, all children should be learning together. Social integration of children with disabilities into classrooms populated with typically developing children is a huge benefit to all, both those with and those without disabilities. Here are the essential elements of this social developmental Montessori inclusion model. Regarding early detection and intervention and social integration, did you know that 80% of the child's brain capacity develops before the age of 3? The gains from early intervention are most significant for those at maximum disadvantage. So early assessment and early intervention, coupled with close family involvement and social integration, will significantly optimize the learning potential. So what does it mean to have a developmental perspective? This means that providers are trained not only in their specific discipline, but also in understanding how different conditions impact the child's ability to progress along the developmental pathway and what possible ancillary issues may develop. They know specific strategies to thwart these issues and promote development. So I wanted to just spend a minute on this interdisciplinary team concept. So multidisciplinary means many different disciplines, and that's very important. But in interdisciplinary work, we have many practitioners from different disciplines sharing and collaborating together so that the ideas and the conclusions that they reach as a group are more potent than anything they could have done as individuals. Dr. Helbrugge was very concerned about minimizing the negative psychosocial impacts of disability on children. He focused on providing supports and experiences that would ameliorate these impacts. So he wanted the social, emotional, and well-being of children and academics to be of equal importance. And I think that is very, very interesting. This seems to have some kind of timer on it. When there are emotional issues that are identified, they're addressed by professionals. And there's a strong focus on intensive relationship building. So in addition to developmental medical perspective integrated into each child's program, there's a strong focus on frequent communication with parents and the team. And this allows the team to function as problem solvers and supports to one another and to address issues that are raised. Excuse me. Oh, to address issues that are raised and to arise and to ensure that the child is moving forward along his developmental path. And to make this a reality, we need to have well-trained staff in sufficient numbers. So early intervention and developmental support is aid to life. It's life enhancing, and it's a social justice issue. When we look only at behavior, we stop seeing the child and only look with an intent to judge whether we need to reward or punish. When we look behind the behavior, we see that little struggling human, our little human, who needs our help with something. So we need to really focus on changing our thinking. We need to view behaviors as communication. We need to ask ourselves, what is the child trying to tell me? And what does this child need? And in the end, we need to really think of the child and his refusal or his difficulty as can't rather than won't. So I'm going to skip ahead to this and just point out what happens if you try to do inclusion without a holistic approach. And this is happening in our very county. FCPS is Frederick County, Maryland, where Catherine and I both live. And this was just December 1st, cited by the U.S. Justice Department, violating federal law in terms of restraint and seclusion of children with disabilities. There were 100% of the students were students with disabilities, and there were 7,253 seclusions from 2017 to 2019. That's only 2 years. 99% of students that were restrained were students with disabilities. And 100% that were secluded were children with disabilities. So I ask you, this is an educator's approach to disciplining children with special needs when they get frustrated. Is this aid to life? Or does this look more like aid to life? This is a sensory room designed by an OT, and it's specifically designed to meet the needs of children with autism who attended a private Montessori program for children with autism in Ohio. So what about this? So that's the end of the section that I have for you. And we're going to have now a poll and check in and see if there's any more questions.
Barbara?
Yeah.
I'm going to read a question.
Okay.
So a person asks, I really would love the idea of challenging the medical model. The medical model is inherently ableist to be readdressed. Many of us who are disabled and neurodivergent do not believe that the medical model is fully representative of our experiences. which is why social models of disability are becoming more prevalent. It's both and, not either or, when it comes to the medical model and social models. How do you think about this?
I think I'm in total agreement with you on this. The social is extremely important. So it is true that the medical world does look for things that are wrong and try to help fix them. So that's very helpful if you have a strep throat or an infected cut, or an appendix that's about to burst. I think in the neurobehavioral realm, it's much more complicated. And this is where, in my opinion, the distinction comes between traditional medical and developmental medical practice. This idea that not only kind of what is autism caused by, or what does it look like, and you also know that every individual with autism is an individual with autism, right? But you understand what some of the lifelong challenges are that individual faces, and you are working to support that individual and make sure that that individual is as socially integrated as possible. That's the goal, as much independence and social integration as possible. So it's very interesting. I think about this a lot, that Temple Grandin talks about her auditory misperceptions and how if she's in a restaurant and someone bangs their fork against the plate, that she feels like someone's putting an axe in her head. So this is a very significant problem for her that really interferes with her ability to integrate into the world and go out and do things. And she talks about her personal frustration that all the medical world wants to do is look at the genetics and figure out what causes autism. And I totally agree with that. We need to be looking at these sensory processing issues that are really, so interfering with people's lives. So I think that we are in full agreement. And I just think the same way that you guys know, right? There are great Montessori schools and there are not so great Montessori schools, right? It's the same in the medical world, and I feel like there are some really straight ahead medical people that don't have a heart and they don't understand development and they don't understand the social inclusion movement, and I would never take my kid to them. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think I totally agree with you.
Thank you, Barbara.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so are we done with the poll? Are we ready to move on?
Looks like everybody who's going to answer has answered.
Okay.
87% very interested in collaborating. Yay. That's a nice answer. I like that. All right. So Catherine is going to give us our third section.
All right. So. And take me a second to get back.
All right. There's another bar.
Is the bar up there again also?
Oh, wait. Now it went away.
Okay. Okay, here we are at the final section of our three-part presentation. So we've talked a lot about the policies and international legal landscape, and we've talked about the medical educational inclusion model. So now we're going to hone in a little bit more on what this looks like in a Montessori school. Of course, in the very limited time that we have today to share with you, we can only just give you a very broad overview, and we encourage you to explore this more through courses offered. And of course, our organization, MMPI, offers courses to help you understand the model better. All right, so we're going to start out by looking at a really important quote from Dr. Maria Montessori. It's always great to start with her magnificent writings, but this quote in particular, it's relatively unknown because it was in a textbook called Pedagogical Anthropology that she published in 1913. And so she gives this grand vision she has for education. So she says, thanks to the system of compulsory education, it gathers to itself every living human being of both sexes and of every social caste, normal and abnormal, and it retains them there throughout a most important period of growth. So she's talking about inclusion in schools. Then she continues, this is the field, therefore, in which the culture of the human race can really and practically be undertaken, and a joint labor of physician and teacher will sow the seed of a future human hygiene, adapted to achieve perfection in man, both as a species and as a social unit. So it's so wonderful to share this with you right at this time, because we have just talked a lot about the importance of inclusion and the medical partnership, the joint labor of physician and teacher. Let's see. Okay, so just a big bird's eye view. What does Montessori inclusion look like? Well, it's not just following the child's choices, it's also following the needs of the child. For children who have atypical development, there's often therapeutic work that needs to happen to get them to get back on track and to make their lives easier for the rest of their life. Another aspect is observations and collaboration, not just by the Montessori guide, but all members of the child's multi-professional team and the parents. So that's what Barbara was talking about, this big team, this collaborative process of working together and all bringing their unique perspectives to see what does this child need. And then making modifications, adaptations, supports, extensions to the method of presentation, to the materials, and to the environment. It's a huge work, but it is being done around the world, and MMPI is offering courses to help you learn more about this work. It's been going on in Europe for 50 years through the Theodor Hellbrugger Foundation trainers. In Europe, they call this inclusion pedagogy. So I love that name. It really focuses on the entire inclusive environment. All right, so looking at another from a big perspective, this is a tremendous amount of detail and work that's behind this slide. But just like everything else in Montessori, we must prepare for inclusion. Inclusion requires specific preparations that are different than the preparations we make for our typically developing children. Children with different needs need different preparations. So it's true that every school will not be able to serve every child, but we have to start to formally prepare for children with more diverse needs. The bottom line is, if you're not prepared to include, you're prepared to exclude. In this brief talk, we can't go into all the details behind this, but I want to give you some general ideas. So the first and most important part is the preparation of the adults. And as all the inclusion research from around the world, there's loads of it, they all point out that the biggest impediment to inclusion is the attitude and beliefs of the adults. So there's a lot of work to do there. Everyone in the building must be trained in inclusion, and the parents and the community professionals need to be oriented to both Montessori education and inclusion. Preparation of the adults also includes determining the specific needs of every child. That's the big team. This means screening, it means evaluations, and it means differential diagnosis. Only then will we know how to help the child's development, and therefore how to prepare to meet their needs. Then the environments must be prepared. Think Montessori version of universal design. This includes buildings, classrooms, therapeutic spaces outside the classrooms, and even the outdoor environments. Finally, the materials of development must be prepared. This is in addition to a complete implementation of the Montessori method and materials for typical children. A high fidelity classic Montessori program is the foundation for Montessori inclusion. But it is not all there is. For children with different needs, they usually need, at least in the beginning, accommodations such as adaptations and modifications to the Montessori method and materials in your albums, as well as supports and sometimes supplemental therapeutic methods, such as the Orton-Gillingham approaches for your students with dyslexia. For many Montessorians, all of these differences from their Montessori training make them very uncomfortable. But for many other Montessorians, they feel monumentally relieved because they knew that what they were doing was not helping all of their children. So this is just an example of the types of adaptations, so you have a little more insight into what I'm talking about when we adapt the Montessori method that we learned in our training. We can adapt the length of the presentation. We can add preparatory steps, so work that might need to come just so that they can access the Montessori curriculum. Adaptation of the lesson direct and indirect aims of the presentation. Professor Joachim Dattke, the director of training for the Hellberger Foundation, said that often it's the indirect aims that we work on most with our children with disabilities, at least at the beginning. We might have to make modification of the Montessori materials, and we might have to modify the control of error. So I'm coming back to here, because when we start to think, wow, there's a lot of work that has to be done, where do we begin? So I think this is a great diagram because it's both an endpoint and a path. So I kind of think of this as a picture of what the percentages in every school. So of your students who have disabilities, that they are approximately in these percentages that reflects the community prevalence. And that can be seen as a goal. But it's also, this can be seen as a path. So when we, as a growth path, when we begin building our inclusion capacity, we can look at, well, what is the greatest number of children who have a particular disability and look at the need in our community. So I often advise Montessori schools to begin building their capacity to serve children with dyslexia. So we look at the top line, which is way bigger than any other category. 33% is specific learning disability. More than 80% of children with that are identified with a specific learning disability have dyslexia. So every Montessori school needs to provide for the needs of children with dyslexia. And dyslexia is a developmental difference. It's a neurophysiological difference. Their brains are structured and function differently. And there's a lot that you need to know to serve these kiddos to keep them from struggling all their lives. So if you want to start with the largest percentage of kids who need help, you can start with kids with dyslexia. You can do a universal screening. I also have some really exciting news. Leading dyslexia neuroscientists Fumiko Heft and Nadine Gabb have both developed dyslexia screeners that can predict at age 4 with 90% accuracy a child's risk for reading failure. These tools are just now becoming available. Now we can screen and jump in with early intervention for dyslexia. Dr. Heft found that early intervention for dyslexia, the Orton-Gillingham approach, was 4 times more effective than waiting and using the same approach in the mid-elementary grades, which unfortunately is pretty standard practice. So is early screening, early identification, and early treatment consistent with Dr. Montessori's ideas about aid to development? Let's look at some quotes. So here she says, many defects which became permanent, such as speech defects, the child acquires through being neglected during the most important period of his age, the period between 3 and 6, at which time he forms and establishes his principal functions. So that's pretty strong language to say that if we don't get in there and do something to help them, early intervention, that we are neglecting them. And then she has another great quote. If for the attention which we paid to the correction of linguistic defects in children in the upper grades, we would substitute a direct direction of the development of language while the child is still young, our results would be much more practical and valuable. And that's exactly what Dr. Heff found, is that the timing of the intervention makes a huge difference in how thorough the correction can be and how valuable it is to the child's entire development. So early intervention is an insight from developmental medicine. And it is, it's an indisputable fact that early intervention can be a tremendous help to a child's development. But what really astounds me is that Maria Montessori understood this in 1912. You know, this is astounding, at least outside the Montessori world. Montessorians kind of know this because this is the developmental insight that lies behind her theories of the importance of education during the first plane of development. So if current neuroscience can help us identify children at risk, of course we would want to do that. And we would want to start interventions immediately. So just to give you just a very quick look at what is Orton-Gillingham, for those of you who are not familiar with it. Orton-Gillingham is an approach that was very closely aligned, with the Montessori language development approach. The main difference is that it was experimentally developed on the population of children with dyslexia, not on typical children. So Orton-Gillingham is scientific pedagogy applied to children with dyslexia. That is why across the United States, states are requiring their educational systems identify children with dyslexia. And in many cases, they require that they provide an Orton-Gillingham approach to teaching these children how to read. So all Montessori schools really should prepare to offer this intervention to their students. So, all right. I just want to say this briefly because we've talked a lot about therapy and we know a lot about Montessori developmental education and sort of trying to make a little bit of a distinction and the difference. So the Orton-Gillingham approach it's a language therapy. It's a therapeutic intervention. Therapeutic interventions seek to raise the level of skill development and functioning in areas of identified deficits. And also therapeutic interventions teach the use of accommodations, strategies, and support to help the child's functioning right away. When you're doing Orton-Gillingham tutoring, what you're doing is you're changing the way the child's brain processes written language. So it's different than what we think of as developmental education, which provides opportunities for self-development and self-expression and stimulates optimal growth in all developmental domains. So they are a little bit different. The therapeutic interventions are meant to change the developmental path to strengthen it and help the child improve their functioning, not just in the areas of their deficits, but take away barriers for them for succeeding in their areas of strength as well. So here's a quote from Dr. Montessori, and this is from 1913 Rome Lectures. She said, "I repeat and insist, I did not wish to originate a method of education, nor am I the author of a method of education. I have helped some children to live, and I've set forth the means which I found necessary. And these means are a method of education. And if these means of help are a method of education for children of this age, then all aids to the development of humanity are also methods of education." So I just hope that these quotes from Dr. Montessori herself will help you think a little bit more broadly about the assistance we give to children with different needs. So this is a really foundational quote in our work at MMPI. So she is pointing out the difference between the needs of children who have developmental and learning differences and children who are typically developing. I'm just going to read this part, but I encourage you to read the entire passage or to come take one of our courses where we study this in depth. The Montessori Method, 1912. She says, "The difference in reaction between children with developmental and learning differences and children who are typically developing in the presentation of didactic material made up of graded stimuli. This difference is plainly seen from the fact that the same didactic material used with children with developmental disabilities makes education possible, while with typical children, it provokes auto-education." This was a just earth-shaking discovery for Dr. Montessori, and she writes about that, so I hope you'll look up this quote. But basically, it seems that the Montessori organizations in their training courses focus on this auto-education part. For typical children, it provokes auto-education. And that is fantastic, because that was, before her discovery, it was unheard of to think that children could educate themselves. But what we're doing in our work is coming back to those 3 words prior to that: makes education possible. We can't forget, we can't leave behind all the children who have developmental disabilities, who are off that typical path of development and can't just walk in and start auto-educating. We've got to return to her writing in this area and look at the concept of makes education possible. Her method makes education possible for these children. So just to very quickly, I'm just going to point out, these are the Montessori schools that serve children with more diverse needs through collaboration with medical and health professionals. So the top one, DC Society for Crippled Children or Children with Disabilities, started as far back as 1962, and that program no longer exists. Mario Montessori was very involved with that program. There's Penfield Montessori Academy, which actually predates the Helbrigers Aktion Sonnenschein project by 1 year, but that project didn't continue as a Montessori school until in 2015, it was opened as a Montessori public charter school, and that's where we held our first Foundations of Montessori Inclusion training course. There's the Shelton School and Evaluation Center, Raintree Montessori School. I haven't been there, but I've read many, many articles about it. Sounds fantastic. Alexander Graham Bell Montessori School serves children who are hearing impaired or deaf. Fantastic program. I've been there and I recommend you go and see it. Indianapolis Public Montessori Schools integrated their autism programs into their public Montessori programs in the early 90s. And they partnered with a local children's hospital to make it work, and it's fabulous. And then there's Elizabeth Academy in Salt Lake City, which opened an inclusion by design program for a Montessori program. There are schools in all over the world that we're working with in our current course, in the Philippines, in Scotland, in Ghana, in I can't even remember all the different ones, but this work is being done by Montessori schools, and it's absolutely fantastic. This, I want to briefly throw this out because what we've presented, it may come across as pretty overwhelming, and you might think it's not possible or that it's just not realistic. But I do want to say that in traditional education, they're also moving in this direction. There's the School-Based Health Alliance, which was founded in 1995 as a social justice movement that provides medical clinics in public schools. And then there's a smaller project by Priscilla Chan, who's a pediatrician and teacher and married to Mark Zuckerberg. And they also started a project that combines the medical and the educational. And so here's the two gentlemen who are really promoting the expansion of school-based health clinics across the United States. Their goal is to have in the United States 25% by 2025, 25% of all public schools have school-based health clinics. And this is the Priscilla Chan project, which is also really, really interesting. And so they say, our comprehensive model brings together all of the adults in a child's life, including parents, educators, and medical and mental health providers, starting from an early age. And that how this is a social justice movement to serve underserved communities who don't have access otherwise. All right, so in Montessori, I know we're running out of time. Between the ideal and the possibility of its realization, there's a great difference. The ideal cannot be united to the aspiration without a long and tedious work. And that is what we have ahead of us in this Montessori inclusion work. It's going to be a long and tedious work. So this is just another quote from the Director General of UNESCO. To rise to the challenges of our time, a move toward more inclusive education is non-negotiable. Failure to act is not an option. Okay, so I know that our time is up, and I do want to offer this for those of you who are, who have 6 minutes. This is one of the schools that we are collaborating with through our Foundations of Montessori Inclusion Elementary. There's an inclusion school by design in Ghana that was initially opened as a traditional school, and now they have partnered with the Montessori Foundation of Ghana to transition their schools to Montessori schools. And it's absolutely fabulous. So I hope you'll stick around. We do have, let's do our last poll, and then we'll play the video after that. How about that, Rebecca?
While they're doing the poll, will you make the PowerPoint accessible so that folks have the direct contact to some of the information that you presented today?
Yeah, we'll have to put that together. And so within a few days, we can provide that to you.
Okay. There were a lot of requests for that, so that people have the sites that they can go to and research.
Yeah, I know it. We just, an hour and a half is really short. we like to present for days and days. There's so much to learn, and you just start your journey, and the PowerPoint will have lots of resources to start looking into yourself.
And for all those that are participating today, session 2 with Christine Lowry will be next Thursday at the same time to give a little different view. And we look forward to you returning. And before we send before we start the video, I just want to thank you both for this fabulous, fabulous presentation. And as you said, it's a lot of information, but it is so important. And thank you for your time today. And we will be sure to get the information out to those that participated. And we are just all thankful. I know I can speak for those that participated, and I can also speak for my colleagues that attended today. And also thank you to Stacy for navigating the technology. All right, let's play it.
All right.
I think Stacy's got it to play, right?
Yeah, Stacy's gonna play it.
Thank you, Stacy.
Who am I? I'm a human being. So when I first came here, I remember I was just scared of everybody that had a challenge. I used to laugh at people who had challenges. But then when I came here, I realized that, you know, I can't laugh at them anymore because right now they're just the nicest people in the world.
We have students who have got really high needs in the school. We also have very able students in the school, so it's really a unique meeting place.
Inclusion means everything to me. It means not isolating a child and not discriminating against a child who has done absolutely nothing in life, but is faced with some difficulty or challenge, and because of that is thrown away or thrown out of society.
Every single child matters. We need to be able to change people's perception of people who have disabilities because they think people with disabilities cannot achieve. Well, they cannot achieve if we don't give them the right services.
Good. Right. So here, Susie.
I'm Susanna Atobra-Siedu. I'm a teacher in multi-kids. I've taught in the mainstream for a very long time. Children who have even handwriting, which is not nice, sometimes they are tagged. But multi-kids, it is not like that. My son who is here couldn't speak English. He didn't even know what "ah" was. And today he can read. And nobody laughed at him, nobody teased him. And you know, it has built some kind of confidence. And I see myself, wow, what a place. Because if it had been any other place, I know by now he would have gotten a name. They would have tagged him with a certain name. But multi-kids is not like that. And that's why I call it a family. Yeah, it's a family. It's not a school, it's a family. Yeah.
We have a diverse student population. Now, to really service that population truly and honestly, we need a diverse staff with a whole range of different experiences. When I heard that there was a deaf teacher who was interested in coming to the school, I was like, wow, that's amazing.
My work with children is preference. They are very lovable children. We break to one, we cry to one, we try everything to one, we share, we give.
The really unique thing about Mabel is because she doesn't hear, she's able to focus like 150% on working with the children. So when you see her working, you just can only imagine what it feels like to be that child in her space that she's provided.
We came to work with Multi Kids Academy to choreograph the end of term show, which opened to the public and parents. Last night was a massive celebration of people from different diverse places coming to form one big community to celebrate the achievements of our students. I mean, the atmosphere was electric. There was a student. She was very shy, she had no confidence, and yesterday she performed a dance on her own for about 2 minutes. Absolutely incredible. I mean, you can't buy this anywhere. The reaction that we got from parents was very positive.
They've seen their children in a new light. Suddenly, a parent sees their child as an artist, as a great dancer, as a poet, that usually they don't see it in everyday life.
Over the few months that my daughter has been here, I realized that she loves the school to the max. The love that the staff, the teachers, from the gate to the last person shows her is just amazing. You don't get it in other schools. You don't get it in other Ghanaian creches. In fact, in other places, they actually shoving them or throwing them somewhere because they do not see any future in them. I always hope that Multi-Kids Foundation gets more support to support those who cannot afford to bring their children here, because we need it.
One of the things that I want to achieve is to ensure that we spread this message across the country. We have so many people who are disadvantaged in special education because they don't have those interventions that we put in place here for students to achieve. We find people who are from very poor backgrounds whose parents have hidden them away because it is a shame for them to be in society. And I want to desensitize people. We want people to be able to say, listen, there's a service here that we can access. And therefore, my biggest aim is to spread Multi-Kids in every single region in the country.
Disability transcends class, it transcends professions, and we have some families who really don't have money for school fees. And I can honestly say to date that I haven't turned away one family without being able to offer them something. For some families it might be a therapy session a week. For other families we've offered them a place. In order for us to sustain this approach, we've set up a foundation. So Multi-Kids Foundation is there to support needy families and really try and bring those children into the picture, because we are a community. We are a community. We're not just a little bubble.
I'm about to go off to college, and my future plan is to come back here and help run projects for the future students that are going to be here. I was totally wrong back then. Maybe I was just stuck up or something. But when I came here, I just realized that no, these people need some help. And if I could help them, I would. I'll just do anything I can. And like that's what I want to stand for, you know. That's just it.
Wow.
Isn't that fantastic?
Fantastic.
Yeah.
A nice way to end our time together. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for
Bye.
coming. Thanks for
Bye-bye.
staying.